For most people, the pivotal attack on Arnold Bennett came in 1924 when Virginia Woolf published a pamphlet called Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, which was actually a lecture that Virginia Woolf gave. There are 2 or 3 iterations of this paper, but they all substantially, say the same thing.
Hello, students and graduates. Welcome to PhD Lounge, the podcast of late-night interviews with PhD students where they have a drink and talk about their research subjects. I am your host, Luis, and I want to thank you for listening to the first official late-night interview ever of this podcast. It was very interesting and educational to hear Felicity McKee talking about her research on disability in Britain during the 19th century, along with present-day events such as the Tokyo 2020 Paralympics, linking it with the past, as well as her role at the non-profit organization Chronically Fabulous. While Felicity was discussing about societal and linguistic challenges toward disabled people by pointing out examples of asylums and sanatoriums, the sick room and workhouses as visible environments through letters of medical doctors and documents of registered patients, wheelchair users, and other disabled individuals seen as equal and having equal rights and accessibilities as non-disabled have, the intervention of disabled women in 19th century Britain, and the future of the current population in terms of potentially reaching a high percentage level of disabled people, I can say that, first of all, I was astounded when she stated how many disabled people we may have in the future. Honestly, despite trying to absorb as much information as I can, whether on my PhD research and outside of it, there are always tiny rabbit holes with valuable information that is impossible to retrieve what is inside of them. Some are possible, but it takes time, knowledge, and life experience to do so. And second, I have also learned that by linking modern-day disability issues with the past, there are still societal behaviors that us, non-disabled people, has cemented on our minds, and we must re-educate ourselves and create more solutions to tackle the problem of inequality between disabled and non-disabled peoples in all forms of disability. If you have not had the time to listen to it, go search my interview with Felicity talking about these important and historical pieces of information and other more features of her research at your preferred podcast platforms. Who knows, you might be interested in exploring this topic, whether in this century or even going further back in time when writing your research proposal. You can follow Felicity's social media at Facebook, Felicity McKee, and Twitter at McKee_Felicity, where she actively posts lots of tweets about disability. I also want to welcome the new students who started their first year at university. I am glad that you had a fantastic first week of freshman induction parties and possibly have met other students from other courses as well as second and third year ones. I can say to you that I had to an induction week when I started university, and although I went to parties, the type of inductions for freshmen in my home country Portugal was rather being painted with lipsticks, gluing my head with donkey ears, calling me friendly names like beast, bi-faced, horned, singing songs to other students, infiltrating into other welcoming parties, wearing girls' clothing, screaming my nickname louder, which I do not remember since it had passed 7 years, getting pies on my face, and other funny things. Despite some of the things I did were inappropriate, I had a good time back then, nevertheless, and made some friends which I am still in touch with. Anyway, whatever the course you are studying, I can assure you that it will be a tough journey, as you have to do many oral presentations, writing assignments, tests, exams, and final dissertations. But if you pull up your socks and make an effort, better chances shall appear in your future. So therefore, all the best with your studies, and hopefully consider going further through MA and later PhD when you are close to becoming a graduate, if you want to do so, of course. Now, turning to today's session, we have another late-night interview, this time with a second-year PhD student based at Swansea University as well. He is examining literary and critical reputation in the late 19th century and early 20th century through the novels of one of the best English novel writers in British literature called Arnold Bennett. Besides that, he also provided to me his CV, and I was amazed with his professional career, yet boldly questioning myself while I was reading his email when he said his age. A reason for doing a PhD at such an advanced age. But at the same time, I have to say that there are no limitations nor specific age rate to go for a PhD, as it is completely for us to decide our right time to do research of this level. So please have a seat, put on your headphones or earplugs, have a cup of tea or coffee, and let's give a warm welcome to David Finch. So David, welcome to PhD Lounge, and thank you for being my guest for today's interview with such an interesting topic. But before I ask you about what your research topic it is, let me ask you, doing a PhD at such an advanced level, is it a quite challenging thing to do? Am I right or am I wrong? What led you to decide to doing a PhD at this advanced stage?
Yeah, thank you, Louise, and I'm really glad to be part of your podcast. The reason I'm doing a PhD is that just over 2 years ago, I left my job as vice principal at Coleg y Cymoedd. And the reason I left the job was there was yet another reorganisation taking place. Further education has undergone a lot of structural changes in the last 10 or 15 years, and I decided that I didn't want to have to undertake yet another role. So I decided to leave. I was 65 at the time, and I'd spent virtually the whole of my professional career in further education. I then spent 6 months wondering what it was that I was going to do next. Because the one term that I won't use is retirement. People say to me, "Oh, you've retired from work, have you?" And I said, "No. I left work 2 years or so ago. I haven't retired." So for 6 months, I wondered what it was that what would I do next. I knew I didn't want to go to return to full-time employment, but I thought about possibly consultancy, because I've done consultancy previously. I thought about the possibility of voluntary work. I thought about study, but I wasn't sure about that. And then a good friend of mine moved from the University of South Wales to the University of the West of England in Bristol, and he's a professor in business studies, and he invited me over to the University of the West of England for lunch, February time, a couple of years ago. and I had a really good time. And while I was walking around the campus, I thought, I really like the atmosphere of community learning and the vibrancy of the place. And I thought, I want to do something like this.
Right.
Quite astonishingly, about a week or so later, I think it was through my Facebook feed, there was a link to a postgraduate open day at Swansea. So I went along to that, with some slight trepidation, because I graduated from Swansea in 1975. I got my master's degree in 1987, but that's a long, both of them are a very long time ago. But I went along. It was a very useful and informative open day, and I was quite heartened by the age range that I saw in the lecture theatre. Until I realised that the older people in the audience were actually the parents of people who were there to study either MAs, MScs, or PhDs, and I think I was the only student over 55 or whatever it was in the particular audience. But when I went along to talk to the English literature staff, nobody commented about my age at all. They were simply interested in my research proposal, which I outlined. It was somewhat crude at that point. Didn't have too much shape to it, obviously. But they listened intently to it and said, yeah, that's something that's workable as a proposition. Put in an application, work up your proposal, and we'll take an interest in it. So I felt very heartened with that, and I submitted the proposal. I had to rework it, but that was very useful, and it was accepted. And I don't feel that it's something that PhD study is difficult because of my age. I think the hardest thing I've found so far has been the fact that the first year of my study has been undertaken entirely under COVID. So I've not been to the university. Everything has been online, and it isn't quite the experience that I was expecting.
Right. That's you hit the major point, which is still currently nowadays, even though the COVID issue has been reduced with the double jabbing vaccines, but it still hits so hard in accessing valuable resources. But as you say, and I said as well, that age rate is not a concern, is the personal decisions that we do, and what motivates us and thrive to do something that we want. It's just a golden ticket, and doing what we love is all that matters. So I can see, for example, my father. I was talking to my father an hour ago about what I was going to do today, and he said, someday I also want to partake into university studies. And I said to him, yeah, go for it. But he's not saying just an excuse, but saying the circumstances of life that happens, because during his time to raise me was very tough. But I think that I'm doing a PhD. My brother is a graduate. My mother, she's a graduate as well. And the last member of the family is my father. And I think taking a PhD with almost 6 years, my father is 56 at the moment, would be the cream of the crop. So I don't see why. It's more knowledge. Knowledge doesn't occupy any space. And seeing from your experience, seeing from your CV, that's all that matters, doing what we love, what we are interested about. And the age rate, once again, it's not a roadblock.
No, absolutely. And, for me, I enjoy the intellectual stimulation that it gives me. And, now that I'll be able to meet up with fellow students, that will even further increase the kind of intellectual challenge and stimulation. And what it means, what I've been able to do is I've had to rebalance my life, because my life has been very much about my professional career, and holding down a senior manager's job in a large further education college was very demanding. It meant I didn't have an awful lot of time for me. And now I've got the balance right, because my life now is really about three things. It's about my PhD, but it's also my wife and family, and then the third element is cycling, because I cycle every day of the week, and nearly every day of the year. I cycle about 200 miles a week. And, last year I cycled over 12,000 miles, the year before 10,000, and I'm on schedule to do another 10,000 this year. So,
wow. So is that part of the PhD as well?
No, it isn't. Although I have there's a nice little anecdote about Arnold Bennett and cycling, which I'll talk about later on. But what I took up cycling about 5 or 6 years ago for health reasons, because I had high blood pressure, and my doctor said, well, it's either tablets or exercise. So I opted for the exercise option. But what I also found is that cycling is really good thinking time. And when I was in full-time work, I would be out on the bike at 5 o'clock in the morning. Because I needed to be in work by just after 8 o'clock. But it's fantastic thinking time in terms of preparing you for the day. And then when I got home, I would I'd only go out for an hour, do 10 or 12 miles, and do the same when I got in early evening. And the early evening bike ride was a good way of getting rid of all the debris of the day. Channeling out all the negativity, and then just reassembling things ready for the following morning. And sometimes I would even talk out loud on the bike, because one of my responsibilities in college was the Welsh language. I'm not a Welsh speaker, but whenever I gave a presentation to staff in college, I would have to introduce it bilingually. So one of the things I did on the bike in the morning was to rehearse that. And fortunately, at 5 o'clock in the morning, there aren't many people on cycle paths around to hear me. It was a good way of getting ready for those things.
Oh, so it's a quite stimulus. So it's kind of say that whilst cycling, you are talking to Bennett's spirit, to some extent, to say in a fancy way and also funny way. But let's now changing the winds and talking about your research. Who is Arnold Bennett? Why choosing literary and critical reputation from Arnold Bennett?
Okay, well, we can trace this back actually all the way to when I was at Swansea University as a graduate, as an undergraduate, I mean, and I was there from 1972 to 1975, and my degree was in English, literature and geography. And one of the requirements in the third year for geography students was to write a thesis, but because I was doing a joint honours, and I was the only student doing English and geography in 1975, I had to write a thesis combining the two topics. Right. And my supervisor in 1975 was a guy called Professor David Herbert, who was an urban geographer. And we had a conversation about this, and he said, well, I think what you could do is you could look at a regional novelist, and he suggested, first of all, Alexander Cordell, who wrote really regional and historical novels about South Wales, about the South Wales industry. I read 2 or 3 of his books, and I said, no, I don't think there's enough geographical scope within them. And he then said, why don't you have a look at Arnold Bennett? And I'd not read any Arnold Bennett until David Herbert suggested him. Even though my hometown is Crewe in the northwest of England, and Arnold Bennett came from the Potteries, which is only 12 or 15 miles from Crewe. So even though I lived very close to the place where he was born, I hadn't read any of his books. And I still remember the first Bennett book that I bought. It was a volume of short stories called The Grim Smile of the Five Towns. And I bought it at a bookshop in Liverpool. I'd gone up to Liverpool from Swansea to see a friend. And immediately I read the first few stories. I knew that there was enough scope within that material to undertake my sort of undergraduate project. And I completed it. After I left university, I became a member of the Arnold Bennett Society, and in my early 20s, I became the editor of the Arnold Bennett Society newsletter, which I did for a number of years, and then later on became chairman. And then after I'd completed my master's degree in 1987, which was actually on 18th century literature, I decided that what I needed to do was to follow that up straight away with going to do a PhD. So towards the end of 1988, I was accepted at Keele University to do a PhD on Arnold Bennett. What happened was that within a year, I had applied for a job in South Wales in a college in Port Talbot, and I got that job, and I started in Port Talbot in January 1990, and it was just impossible, because we're talking about pre-internet days. It was just impossible for me to carry on being a student at Keele University, because the distance between South Wales and Keele, it's 170, 180 miles, and when you can't do it online, it makes it impossible. So I think I only did I think 2 terms possibly, and that's all that I did, and I had to give it up. But the germ of what I was going to do at Keele back in 1988 or 1989 remains central to what I'm doing at Swansea all these years later. So that the origin of my interest in Bennett for research purposes has got a very, very long genesis, and it's just nice now to be able to actually to complete what I'd intended to do all those years back. And in terms of Arnold Bennett himself, he was born in 1867 in the Potteries, and it was a region that he, in his fiction, called the Five Towns. He died in 1931. He had a very unusual death because he actually contracted typhoid fever by drinking unbottled water in a Parisian restaurant. And of course, very much in the 20s and 30s, it was a very unwise thing to do, to drink tap water.
Yes.
He was a prolific novelist. He published novels from right the way through from 1898 through to 1931 when he died. He wrote across an amazing number of genres. Because he was a novelist, but he was also a short story writer. He wrote what he called pocket philosophies. He wrote travel books. He wrote literary criticism. He wrote plays. He wrote libretto to 2 operas, etc. And that's a very, 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 very wide range of text for one author to complete. One of the challenges that Bennett faced, though, and this is part of my of research, is that he sold a lot of books. And in some critics' eyes, that made him a materialist, somebody who therefore couldn't be a literary artist because he was commercially successful. And it's true that some of his books were written largely to realise their commercial aims. But I think what is unfair is the way that all of his work has been critically denigrated.
Right. But is it for as you are exploring that, is from what you've said to me, the Arnold Bennett's richer career is quite vast and also said rich. But as you said, his career was heavily criticized just for the commercial issues because, as you said, he was getting plenty of money, or was it his literary genre or writing style, or both?
It was a mixture of all of those. And I mean, what's interesting is is when you look at the times when Bennett first started to write. And that's the 1890s, and the 1890s is very much a decade of churn and turbulence within literature. And when Bennett started to write, it was in the days of what was called the three-decker or the three-volume novel. And by the end of the 1890s, that had actually completely disappeared. The 1880s and 1890s, or if you look at France earlier than that, were very much the decades of naturalism that then led to realism. And
also Impressionism, perhaps.
And Impressionism came later. And obviously that naturalism and realism had their own narrative literary structures, which by the time, if you think about probably from about 1910 onwards, was starting to be regarded as being obsolete, because you had the early stages of modernism were already happening, and potentially modernism, you could potentially trace it back as early as the 1900s, and Bennett's literary style was very much in the realist mode, and because he largely stuck with that, he was then heavily criticised. Heavily criticised for that. But I think one of the to me, and again this is part of my research, is that how was the dominant critical voice in relation to Bennett formed, and was it formed on the basis of all the books that he read, or was it on the basis of people being highly selective about what they didn't read, as well as being highly selective about what they did read? And my argument will be is that people simply didn't read him, because what a close reading of Bennett will give you is a very different kind of writer. A lot of his books are very rich in irony, but only a slow and careful reading of that will reveal it.
Right.
And stylistically, he covered more than naturalism and realism. I don't claim him to be a modernist. Potentially he might be regarded as a proto-modernist. But to label everything under one heading, to me, is inaccurate. And the other thing that I'm studying, which there's very little work on at all, are caricatures and parodies of Bennett. And what's interesting is that of the parodies that I've read so far, and there are a lot more to be unearthed, is that very few of them, there's only one that I can think of by Max Beerbohm, are able to capture the tone and the voice of his writing. Now, if you're going to parody somebody's work, what you have to be able to do is that you really have to be able to get at the heart of how they write, and the tone that they use, and the voice that they use, and the vocabulary that they use. Otherwise, it becomes nothing more than, well, a cheap insult, because parody is very difficult to effect, and the best parodists are those where you can't tell the original from the parodist.
I see. So that's where the criticism comes into play, because he's using irony, perhaps to, as you say, I would say in more general, is to criticize what society was going into, because I believe that the background of the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Neo-Impressionism, but also the beginning or maybe the rise of feminism as well. Everything that Bennett, I believe, criticized and used in his literature as an effect of irony to criticize what society was into. Is that right, what you're trying to explore in your research, while Bennett is considered as realist and naturalist?
Yeah, what I want to get at the very heart of is why was he criticised in the way that he was criticised? Because some of the criticism is very, very personal, and just to give you an example, I'll just read a little bit from John Carey's book, The Intellectuals and the Masses, which was published in the 1992, and John Carey was then professor at Oxford. I think he may still hold some title like that, and he made Arnold Bennett the hero of this book, and he quotes a number of writers about Bennett. So here we have Virginia Woolf's brother-in-law, an art critic called Clive Bell, who described Bennett as an insignificant little man and ridiculous to boot. And he went on, he was the boy from Staffordshire who was making good, and in his bowler hat and reach-me-downs he looked the part.
Right.
Somerset Maugham said that Bennett looked like a managing clerk in a city office and was rather common. Wyndham Lewis sneered at his grocer's origins. Bertrand Russell found him so vulgar that he couldn't bear to be in the same room as him. And then the final comment here is from T.S. Eliot, who in a letter in 1917 he'd been discussing psychic research with W.B. Yeats, when a red-faced man with an air of impertinent prosperity and the aspect of a successful wholesale grocer came up and interrupted them in a most disagreeable Cockney accent. So there's a lot of personal spite and sort of personal vendetta crammed into that, and I really want to get at the heart of why that is. Why was the criticism that was launched on Bennett of such a personal nature? I mean, some of it is to do with class, obviously, and the T.S. Eliot's remark about having a Cockney accent is simply shorthand for him being working class, because there's no way that Arnold Bennett could have had a Cockney accent, because the Staffordshire accent is very, very distinctive, and there's no way that Bennett would have acquired a Cockney accent, even though he went to live in London, when he was aged 21. But by the time Eliot had met him, Bennett had lived in France for 8 or 9 years. So it's a ridiculous comment to make in some respects.
It's kind of interesting. But when he moved to France, therefore was the criticism that started. I believe that he started to earn some money there as in his editor jobs, or was it when he was still living in England?
Yeah, I mean, you touched upon a really critical issue there, because for most people, The pivotal attack on Arnold Bennett came in 1924 when Virginia Woolf published a pamphlet called Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, which was actually a lecture that Virginia Woolf gave. There are 2 or 3 iterations of this paper, but they all substantially, say the same thing. And what Virginia Woolf argues is that Bennett doesn't understand character in fiction because he's only interested in the externality of character, and he's not interested in what happens in the interior mind of characters. And that was the heart of it. But what's interesting is that when you trace it back, and I haven't found the first attack, I don't think yet, is how early the attacks actually started. And I've traced it back to 1903 with the first major attack, and that was a review of a book that Bennett published anonymously called The Truth About an Author. And that was reviewed in, among other places, in a magazine called Blackwood's Magazine by somebody called Charles Whibley. And that's the first attack that I've found. And among the things that Whibley says, Whibley says he is an author and proud of the title, but he recognises that authorship is a trade like another, and he plainly asserts that only one end justified its pursuit: money. So, that was the sort of first hint of the mercantile nature of potentially mercantile nature of Bennett's work. But Whibley's article is a complete misreading of the truth about the truth about an author, and the clue is given in the title, in the second word, because while there are vestiges of truth within that book, there's a lot of untruth about it anyway. So Whibley has already missed the irony as early on as the title. And then I found other critical pieces about Bennett well before Virginia Woolf. Catherine Mansfield in 1913 in a parody. Clive Bell, who I've already mentioned, in 1918, who published a book called Pot Boilers. And the preface to that book is another attack on Bennett. So to me, one of the intriguing questions is that why did Virginia Woolf leave it as late as 1924 to launch her attack on Bennett, given that some of her cultural friends were criticising him well before then, and in fact Woolf herself, in a review of Bennett's book Books and Persons, which was published in 1916, I think it was 1917, she reviewed that in the Times Literary Supplement. But in those days, the Times Literary Supplement, nearly all the contributions were anonymous. So I've been puzzled by why, if she felt this way, why didn't she convert a Times Lit article into a pamphlet or a booklet and attack Bennett at the time? So I still remain puzzled as to why she left it as late as 1924.
Well, this seems interesting. I cannot say much as you know, because it's not my area of expertise. But it's quite curious. Perhaps I would take a guess. Maybe Virginia Woolf would be influenced and waiting for what other critical writers said about Bennett, and her trying to conjugate what others said to build her proper criticism. maybe her influence over feminism, because I've read some articles about her. I've actually watched her movie. I do not know what the title of the film is, but I can certainly assure that her attack would have some effect about her feminist character, perhaps.
Yeah, you're right on that, because Bennett published a book called Our Women,
right,
and it wasn't well received by feminists, and I think it was, although she doesn't mention that in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, it's undoubtedly a subtext in the what some people see as a critical war between Virginia Woolf and Arnold Bennett. But for there to be a war, there had to be two parties engaged in the action, and Bennett largely didn't respond to the attacks that came from Virginia Woolf. You know, he makes, because in the 1920s he was from about 26 to 19 through to 1931. He wrote a regular weekly column for the Evening Standard newspaper, which was then owned by Lord Beaverbrook, and Bennett and Beaverbrook were personal friends, and it was at Beaverbrook's request and behest that Bennett started to write a column in the Evening Standard. And in a couple of the Evening Standard columns, he makes reference to the fact that there was supposed to be some kind of a dispute between him and Virginia Woolf, but he doesn't really know much about it. I think that's partly because in those days, from the 1890s through to the 1930s, a lot of literary debate was actually spoken rather than written.
Yes.
Well, it was both, but there was an awful lot of spoken, literary criticism at the time. And one of the features about Bennett was that he had a terrible stammer. So when it came to any kind of public speaking, or even speaking in social settings, he found it remarkably difficult. There's a famous occasion when he was invited back to Stoke to speak, and I forget the particular audience, but he didn't speak for very long. And what he did, he held up his pen and he said, "This is how I speak." And I think, had he not had that stammer, because he was certainly in social settings with Virginia Woolf, that I think without that stammer, then I think he would have engaged in lively conversation with her, and it would have been very interesting to see what the outcome of that would actually have been.
It's kind of interesting, and I believe that in the end, Virginia Woolf was, as you were saying, literally had a rather personal attack, maybe some sort of envy, or maybe due to her young age, as I've read in one article by Edwin J. Kennedy Jr., is where after the youth of her arrogance, as he portrays her, although we can't say that in some manner. Virginia Woolf also had high qualities, but we can assume that issue that she did not like Arnold Bennett personally, but also in terms of literary genre and writing style, when he wrote several criticism.
Yes, you're right. And in fact, when Bennett died, she wrote quite a long entry. Virginia Woolf wrote quite a long entry in her diary, and she said it started off something to the effect of, the death of Arnold Bennett leaves me sadder than I thought I would have been, and then there's almost like a stream of consciousness account of what she thought about Bennett, which clearly shows that while she had some respect and admiration for him, it was counterbalanced by criticism. So I think, like a number of other people, that sometimes when they went back to really properly evaluate him, they found qualities that had been missing. So a good example of that is the poet Ezra Pound, who was writing in the New Age at the same time as Bennett. We were talking about the period 1908 to 1911. Very dismissive of Bennett. But later on in life, Ezra Pound admitted that he'd made a mistake by dismissing the book The Old Wives' Tale, which he regarded as being, that had some greatness in it. And it's perhaps an example of where people dismiss a writer on the basis of a couple of books that they've read, rather than looking at the whole field that they produced and selecting across that range.
Sounds that it goes now up top of my head that saying that while you are living, you will be deeply criticized every day. I'm saying that in such an exaggeration, but is literally what it means. Virginia Woolf criticized Arnold Bennett, but at the same time, from what you're saying, she admired him for his reputation, for his profession as editor, writer.
I think she admired him more for some of his human qualities rather than for his literary qualities. She had little time for his literary method and for his literary style because she found it rooted in the past. And we're all victims of circumstance. And it depends, where you're born, when you're born, and I mean, a fascinating element of this is just looking at the whole issue of, literary survivability. And I was reading a book by Franco Moretti a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about. He was writing about the literary field because that's part of my research as well, looking at Bourdieu's work on the literary field. But Moretti made the point that we only look at a tiny part of the literary field because most of the literary field at a moment in history, so if we look, say, for example, at the 1890s, how much of the material that was produced, part of that cultural production in the 1890s, how much of it has survived? And the truth of it, very little of it has survived. And that's not because, there aren't necessarily extant copies of text. It's because, authors have just gone into simply complete obscurity. And, it made me think that, when you do look at the literary field, you are only looking at a tiny, tiny part of it. Moretti says we're only looking at about 5% of that which actually existed, which, can then obviously distort your view of what the literary field was like at the time.
Once again, it's from what you're saying, we know much about Arnold Bennett, but we don't know much about him. Am I right? In terms of what he's trying to say to society, what he's trying to criticize, what aspects are wrong in his point of view. One other thing that I would like to ask, since Virginia Woolf ferociously criticized Bennett through her books, especially Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, was that some type of call to other women who were writers as well during her time? Do you know any other women that criticized Arnold Bennett?
The only one I can think of is a friend of Virginia Woolf's called E.M. Delafield, and she wrote a very commercially successful book called The Diary of a Provincial Lady, which was a sort of a semi-satirical text. But she wrote a number of parodies of Bennett. So while it was sort of what you might call indirect criticism, I'd say she was a friend of Virginia Woolf, and the other writer who had mixed things to say about Bennett, and I don't know whether Rebecca West was a friend of Virginia Woolf's or not. I need to to have a look at that. But Rebecca West was a novelist in the particularly in the 1920s, who had some critical things to say about Bennett, and in fact prior to the 1920s as well, and was very much a feminist. And I think, if I'm right, that when Bennett published Hilda Lessways, which was the middle novel in his Clayhanger trilogy, in a periodical called The Free Woman, which was very critical of Hilda Lessways. I think that particular review was by Rebecca West. I'm not altogether certain. I need to relook at that.
Sounds really interesting once again, and obviously Virginia Woolf criticizing Arnold Bennett was another call for those two brilliant examples of other women writers. Do you know how Bennett reacted to it? Reacted to Virginia Woolf and reacted to Delafield and the other one, Rebecca West?
Yeah, as I said earlier, that with Virginia Woolf, he didn't really react at all. In print. How he reacted in private, I don't know. I mean, he was a man who wrote a lot of letters, and his letters are published in 4 volumes. He also kept a journal throughout most of his life, and there are some references in there, but there's nothing very very detailed. Rebecca West, I think he did write about Rebecca West, and she herself published a little pamphlet, the title of which I've forgotten, where she talked about her 3 literary uncles, which were Bennett, H.G. Wells, and John Galsworthy, it's a sort of a fairly ambivalent text. And she uses the term uncle in both a positive but also a negative sense, and the suggestion that their writing is too avuncular in many respects. With E.M. Delafield, I found no link at all between Bennett and Delafield, and her work was published in the late 1920s, early 1930s in a periodical called Time and Tide, and it's perfectly possible that Bennett never even saw the material, because there's just so much published. You can't read everything that's actually out there.
Sounds that there's plenty of topics to explore about a woman's perspective upon Bennett and how he reacted towards it. Now moving to another question, I saw that you are also using one theory called cultural capital theory from Pierre Bourdieu. I've been doing some research. It is about the transferring power into society, dividing some parts of cultural parts into different categorizations of society. But could you explain a little bit more what that consists of, and how and why can be used to link to Arnold Bennett's literary critical reputation?
Yes, the particular aspect of Bourdieu's work that I'm looking at and using is what he calls the literary field, and he writes about that in detail in his book, The Field of Cultural Production. And the very specific dimension of the literary field that I'm looking at is the process of what Bourdieu calls consecration. In other words, it's the way in which writers gain a reputation, and how that reputational process enacts itself. And one of the things that Bourdieu argues, and I fully agree with him here, is that the way that a writer gains a reputation, establishes a reputation, and potentially keeps a reputation is due to what Bourdieu calls a number of different agents in the field. And those agents are all people who have a say in the process of producing a cultural artifact. So it not only includes the author, but it includes the publisher, it includes the reader, it includes the printer, it includes the distributor of the work, so that all the people who take part in that process are part of the art and act of consecration. Now, Bourdieu does talk about the opposite of consecration in what I've read so far, but when I do further reading, I may well find this. So, one of the things I want to look at is not only consecration, but its opposite pole, which is desecration. And I want to look at how desecration operates within the literary field, because this is what I think was done to Arnold Bennett, is that Arnold Bennett entered the literary field in the early 1890s through what you might call his journalism. In 1898, his first novel was published by John Lane at the Bodley Head, and John Lane as a publisher was regarded very much as an avant-garde type publisher, and so that was Bennett's first entry into the literary field as a novelist. But he'd had 5 or 6 years working as a journalist or a contributory journalist to that. And then, as I said earlier, The Truth About an Author came out in 1902, 1903, and then we had the Charles Whibley attack. So I'm looking at the literary field in terms of the balance between consecration and desecration. And of course, one of the fascinating things about the literary field is its constant dynamism. So the literary field is never fixed, because all the time you've got new entrants trying to come into the field, and then you've got those people who've achieved consecration. They've achieved what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital. In other words, that what they write is regarded as being literary art, and it's not work for the masses, seeking to maintain their positions and also to keep the newcomers out. So there's this constant battle between, those people who already hold a high position within the field, wanting to deny access to other people, who are newcomers, or what Bourdieu calls aspirants.
Oh, so you can say that upon criticism towards Bennett, that would also blocking the aspirants who were interested in reading Arnold Bennett. Am I right?
Yes. I mean, what you've got is that you've got Bennett himself, of course, was an aspirant in the 1890s, and he entered the literary field. And one of the things I need to do is to chart his positions within the literary field, and that's made more difficult because a critic, a guy called Peter D. MacDonald, he described Bennett as being a maverick in the literary field, and the reason that he calls him a maverick is that he wrote very serious books, but he also wrote commercial serials, which were designed for a mass readership and weren't there for the literary elite, and that poses a big question in relation to the literary field. So, and it's a question that I've not resolved yet. So, does an author hold multiple positions in the field, depending on the genre that they write, or depending on the artistic merit or otherwise, which people attach to it, or do you have an average position in the literary field made up where you aggregate all the works and then you come out with an average score? And at the moment, what my thinking is that you should be able to plot separate positions within the field according to the type of work that the writer is producing at the time. Now, for some writers, the only thing that they really wrote was what you might call creative literature, artistic literature that has an artistic integrity. So they probably have a single position within the field. But what do you do about a writer who writes multiple genre for multiple audiences, some of which is not intended to be artistic in a literary sense, and there's nothing wrong with writing things that aren't that don't have those or ascribe to those particular values. So it's a point that I've got to in my research, which I want to take forward, and it then becomes even more complicated, because what happens when an author's book re-enters the literary field a number of years later? So if we take Bennett's first novel, A Man from the North, published in 1898 by John Lane. We don't know the exact number of copies that were produced, but it's in the region of between 750 and 1,000 copies. So even taking into account the fact that a single book can have multiple readers, when you produce books in that sort of quantity, doesn't have a vast readership. And it wasn't republished by John Lane, and in fact it wasn't republished until 1912, when Methuen, who became one of Bennett's main publishers, decided to republish the book. Now, according to Peter MacDonald, the publication of A Man from the North by John Lane was Bennett's consecration of what he calls a junior purist within the literary field. But how long do you maintain your position if the book that you wrote is only printed in 750 to 1,000 copies, doesn't run into a second edition, doesn't run into a third edition, and the second edition doesn't appear until 1912? So in the period between 1898 and 1912 within the literary field, and and I've already talked about the dynamism before, does Bennett still maintain that of a literary purist because he wrote this book in 1898, or does that start to diminish over time? And then in 1912, when the book was republished, and I've not had the time to look at the reviews that the book received, what happened to its status then? So it all gets quite complicated.
So as you are saying, it all remains an incognito. So it remains still unknown to those who are really emphasizing Arnold Bennett, and then comes with this massive debate, desecration, if I'm correct,
yeah,
that keeps persisting, and even perhaps after his death.
Yes, I mean, this happens to many authors, that after their death, their reputation very often goes into a very steep decline, and sometimes it can take 20 or 30 years for that to recover, and that was certainly the case with Arnold Bennett, even though his journals appeared fairly soon after death. His critical reputation meant that he disappeared almost off the literary map, probably until the 1960s. In academic terms, when a lot of work was done on Bennett. We had the letters that was the start of that, and then we've had an interesting revival which started probably in the late 1990s and continues to this day. But we still have an academic view of Bennett, which is still based around the Virginia Woolf model of interpretation and criticism. But I say to those people, what you need to do is that you need to read the books. You need to read the books rather than other people's views about those books, and then you might change your mind about them.
So that's exactly where you're hitting the point. It is fair to say that Bennett was criticized. After his death, he was acknowledged either by Virginia Woolf or other generation of writers that come up 1950s, 1960s till this day. And one article that I was reading was published in 1997 by the New York Times. I don't know if you have read it, but the headliner is "Who's Afraid of Arnold Bennett?" And you said it right. They have to read the books before jumping into conclusions that were written by his critics. One of the books that this author, called Wendy Lesser, recommends to say what book everyone should read, even those who heard about Arnold Bennett but do not know his background, which book he wrote first. And I think she recommends the first book to read is To the Lighthouse. And then once the reader knows a little bit more about Arnold Bennett's writing style, background, and also his career, she recommends to read The Old Wives' Tale.
Yeah, To the Lighthouse is a novel by Virginia Woolf, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
But there are some interesting parallels between To the Lighthouse and a novel that Bennett wrote called Anna of the Five Towns, and there are some critics who believe that a scene from Anna of the Five Towns was the source of a scene of a similar thing into the Lighthouse. But yes, I mean his most critically acclaimed novel would be The Old Wives' Tale.
So would be that the first book to read? Could you tell us just a summary of Old Wives' Tale?
Well, in essence, it's the story of two sisters, Constance and Sophia, who grew up in the potteries, and their subsequent lives, and what Bennett does is to parallel their lives. So we see them as young girls, and then we see them at the end of the novel, as the title suggests, as old women. And he got his inspiration for writing the book when he was sitting in a restaurant in Paris in about 90, because the book was published in 1908, and I think this scene in the restaurant happened in about 1904, 1905, and he was observing a woman who'd come into the restaurant, an old woman, an overweight woman who was making a great deal of fuss, who was encumbered with all sorts of parcels, and he mused about what kind of life and life experiences she must have gone through, and that was the stimulus, the fact that every old lady has an antecedent history, which is of value recording, and that's the essence of the old wives' tale. Now the two sisters have very separate lives. One continues to live her life right throughout in the potteries, while the other sister actually goes off to live in Paris. And part of the book in the time in Paris is set at the time of the French Revolution. So there's some very interesting sections of the book about about the siege of Paris that took place there. So it's a book that is about the way that we live our lives, and it's a very sensitive portrait of girls growing up to be young women growing into middle age, and middle age growing into old age, and it's told with considerable sensitivity. And what's interesting about this, in terms of what we were talking about before, is that we very much do get to know the interior life of Constance and Sophia, which Virginia Woolf said that Bennett never did. And the whole book, while it has other characters, is about two women and the way their lives develop and what their lives meant to them.
Sounds an interesting book to read, although I'm going to be honest, and don't take this personally, I'm not fancy with English literature. I've never read it, so I cannot construct any criticism, but I was never into literature nor poetry, because for me, I've got to say, they used to say in Portugal, you're thinking on dirt to dirt. So translating to that, I have not the capability to think and giving a wider criticism, so expanding the horizons in a poetry way, in a literary way. So for me, it's difficult. So I don't know. Maybe when I get more experience, I will get to know Arnold Bennett and buy the Old Wives' Tale.
Yeah, I mean, he was. A lot of his books have been translated now. I imagine that some have been translated into Portuguese. Certainly, he was, and in fact, I've been a collector of Arnold Bennett's works for a long, long time. I don't have any in Portuguese, but I have them in Spanish and Catalan and French and Danish and German and Italian. So I would imagine that some are published in Portugal, and Portugal was Bennett was quite well travelled, and he did spend several weeks in Portugal travelling around, and what I'll do, I'll email it to you separately because I can't remember the detail of it now. But in one of his books there is an account of the time that he actually spent in Portugal.
Sounds really interesting. I look forward to it after the interview. So this is a kind of personal question. If you could go back in time and meet Arnold Bennett in his prime, what question or questions would you ask in accordance to your research?
Yeah, really, really good question. This one, and you sent me this in advance. I've had a bit of time to think about it. I still really haven't made my mind up, but I think the first. I'm going to cheat here, and I would want to ask him several questions. So the first question I would ask him would be, can I please record our conversation? And the reason I say that is that there is no video or audio, there's no audio recording of Arnold Bennett's voice, which is astonishing, given how well known he was. There is archival film footage of him, but there's no talking footage of him at all. And I've got some very good friends who assiduously researched this, and it would be wonderful to capture his talking voice, because we don't know what it sounded like. We got people who've written about it, but no more than that. And then the second thing I would ask him, and I talked earlier about the cycling anecdote, is that in 1898, Arnold Bennett with some friends cycled from London to Yorkshire to visit Bronte country, Haworth in the Bronte country in North Yorkshire. And what I would want to do as a cyclist, I wanted to ask him about what kind of journey that was like. Because I mean, if I had support, I could cycle that distance from London to Haworth. But undertaking it in 1898 on those solid tyres on those bikes, with I just find it as absolutely astonishing. And then the big question that I would ask him, because he was a man capable of understanding critical theory, would be, where do you see your place in the literary field, and how was it achieved, and what was your place in the literary field across the decades in which you lived and wrote? So those are the things I would want to ask him.
Sounds fair questions to ask to Bennett, and that's the most interesting part, is to hearing his voice, because at the time the cinema was beginning, there was no voice whatsoever, and I think that would be the pinning question to ask to Bennett. So if you invite me someday to go back in time, maybe I would hear Arnold Bennett, but would be a very interesting question to ask. So now, as we finishing the interview session, do you recommend students to go for a PhD and exploring this topic?
Yes, I would always encourage people to study. My professional life was working in further education colleges, which is all about people learning. I've always believed in the concept of learning for life, and whether it be somebody learning a language to go on holiday, or learning a skill to enter the job market, or upskilling to maintain your skills. To be able to continue to perform, your job, or to undertake research. I strongly recommend people to do that, because it is a stimulus. It's definitely an intellectual stimulus, and it provides people with a purpose in life. It provides you with a focus, and it will also bring you into contact with lots of challenges, some of which you will meet head on and you will survive, and other challenges you will cope less well with. And very early on in our conversation, you talked about rabbit holes, and doing a PhD is very much about rabbit holes. And you have to be careful about which rabbit holes you look into, never mind actually enter, because with some rabbit holes you'll never come out of them.
Right, that's because what I'm talking about rabbit holes, I'm currently in one rabbit hole that it's difficult to climb up, because at the moment I'm doing an introduction about Syrian and Mesopotamian identity.
Right.
And it is difficult to explain what the Greeks and Romans sought during their time in Syria and Western Mesopotamia. And there was such complexity and context that the actual academics cannot retrieve 100%. So that's the difficulty I'm having. And it's a more than 100 miles rabbit hole per se. So I assume that you do not have social media, but if you have any social media, or especially your personal email, which you sent me when you wanted to be interviewed,
right?
Could you share your email account so that any student younger and even at your age rate would be interested in searching Arnold Bennett or exploring an alternative way of describing Arnold Bennett and his work?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not on social media. I use Facebook, but I'm more than happy to share my email address. Yes, I'm happy to do that, Louise. Yes.
Could you say what is your email address?
Yeah, my personal email address is finchdavidg@aol.com.
Any other thing that would you like to share about any curiosity of Arnold Bennett before I end up the session?
Yes, I think just one final point is that as part of my research, one of the things I want to challenge are some mythologies about Arnold Bennett, and one of them, we'll call it the Gwendolen question. And countless critics have claimed that when Bennett wrote for the publication called Woman in the 1890s, where he was assistant editor and then later became editor of Woman, he wrote Gwendolen's column. But if you search through the magazine Woman, and I haven't done this myself. I've accessed certain copies of it, but I've not done a complete search because the copies are in the British Library. But there is no such column in that publication. Yet critics continue to cite this as a way of dismissing him and denigrating him, because what Gwendolen's column purportedly was about socialist, it was to do with women's fashion issues in the 1890s, and obviously that's regarded as being a trivial subject. But John Carey, who I quoted from earlier in the book The Intellectuals and the Masses, repeats the Gwendolen story, which I find astonishing. And 18 months or so ago, when I was searching in the British Library catalogue, one of the search terms in the British Library catalogue had the tag Gwendolen. And I'm thinking, what is all this about? This is entire myth. This person doesn't exist. And yet, it's still embedded there, deep in the heart of Bennett land. And it's an utter mythology.
Thank you for sharing that. And that is up with the session. I would like to thank you for this interesting conversation. You've enlightened me some ideas about who is Arnold Bennett and his work, his criticism, other writers' criticism towards him. And I look forward for some of the advanced work that you are doing. And I would like to see it in the near future when you're doing the Viva Voce, as well as sharing it online. So thank you very much, David, and I'll see you soon.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening to this amazing late night interview with David Finch at PhD Lounge Podcast, talking about Arnold Bennett's literary works and critical reputation through the literary theory of Pierre Bourdieu in the context of modernism or the so-called Belle Époque, and against his critics, have probably enlightened into you some ideas about British novel literature and its reception, in particular about Bennett, if you are or not familiar with. It was also an invitation to travel back in time, where not everything that happened during his time, apart from World War I, was a sea of roses. Many famous writers like Virginia Woolf and others tried to pin him down, but Bennett grasped his grounds and continued to write and publish more fiction and non-fiction novels with different writing techniques and critical thinking. If you are interested in exploring this topic, if you study for a PhD, or if you are talking about contemporary literature, search for Arnold Bennett, his novels, and some research works and documentaries conducted by scholars, writers, critics, and editors. And also, I can provide you some bibliography through David to have an idea of writing a different topic related to his. This interview will be published soon, and after hearing it on your preferred podcast platforms, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, SoundCloud, and others, consider leaving a review to help PhD Lounge become visible for the podcast algorithm. Follow me also on my socials, Facebook at PhD Pod Lounge, Instagram at PhD LMF, and Twitter at PhD Loungecast. You can also check my website, phdlounge-podcast.com, and my email, luis@phdlounge@gmail.com, where you can leave your review there likewise. Thank you all for listening. It has been a pleasure.